All right, this is the last lesson for graphing of trig functions. Today, we're going to do if the trig function is basically tangent of x and also cotangent of x. So first, just a little background real quick. Tangent of x, we notice, okay, if this is our unit circle, by the way, this is the tangent line. So, for example, tangent of 0, right? Straight across is radian 0. Tangent of 0 is in fact 0. But as we move up, notice tangent of whatever angle this is, maybe it's pi over 6, would be this distance right here. Tangent of pi over 4, on the other hand, would be all the way up here. So it'd be this distance. And so as we continue to go up, we notice it gets larger and larger. And then when we go straight up, we notice, by the way, the radian of straight up is pi over 2. We notice, well, this will never actually intersect with this, and so the tangent of pi over 2 is, in a sense, infinity. And so that is why our graph is going to actually have, again, vertical asymptotes. As we go back the other direction, so remember, if I go down on our unit circle, like this direction, you know, instead of rotating up, I start to rotate down. These are negative angles. So this would be like radian negative pi over 6. So tangent of negative pi over 6 is this distance here. It's also a negative distance. Negative pi over 4 gets us down here. And again, straight down, on the other hand, is going to be negative pi over 2. Again, negative pi over 2 will never actually intersect. And so the tangent of negative pi over 2 is also negative infinity in a sense. So what does the graph of tangent x look like? Well, the graph of tangent of x, f of x equals tangent of x, looks like this. Notice 0 is also 0. So actually in the center, we're going to have our vertical axis here. Then we're going to have our horizontal axis. And at 0, tangent will actually be 0. By the time we get to pi over 2, it's up at infinity, and by the time we rotate back to negative pi over 2, it's down at negative infinity, creating these vertical asymptotes, which we've discussed before. By the way, we will also hit our amplitude, which amplitude, again, right here, is whatever the coefficient is, which is an understood 1 in this case. We will reach our amplitude at exactly the halfway point. So in this case, this would be a negative 1. And here's our halfway point. It would be positive 1. This, by the way, is pi over 4, and this is negative pi over 4. And so then we have our actual graph, which comes up from negative infinity, crosses the center, goes out here, and then continues up to positive infinity, like that. And so this is our normal tangent graph. So I'm going to do 2 really fast here. Well, not really fast, but yes, I'm going to do 2 more tangent graphs. So let's do first f of x equaling, we're going to do 3 tangent of 2x plus 5. I'm going to have these 3 numbers. So I'm going to have a vertical shift, which is 5. I am going to have an amplitude, which is 3, and I am going to have a period. Now notice how in sine and cosine, secant and cosecant, the set period is 2 pi. But notice this just goes from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. We don't use the full unit circle to figure out what the graph of tangent looks like. We only use half of it, which means the angle is in fact only pi radians long. So since it's only pi radians long, instead of the period being 2 pi over our b, right? This one's actually just going to be pi over our b, which is in fact pi over 2, right? Now let's actually graph this. So we're going to have a vertical line in the center. This is always true. Then we're going to have our horizontal line out like this. We're going to have 2 vertical asymptotes equally on both sides. So our graph is pretty much always going to look like this. Now, what's the center? Well, the center is our vertical shift, so it's 5. We're going to go up our amplitude, which gets us to 8, and down our amplitude, which gets us to 2. Now, the period is pi over 2. So from here to here, this entire distance must be a distance of pi over 2. That means that this must actually be pi over 4 and negative pi over 4. Exactly half of the period. Now we're ready to graph. So the graph again, so the graph is going to be at the exact halfway mark. It's going to hit our negative amplitude, and exactly the halfway mark, it'll hit our positive amplitude. It's going to come from negative infinity, cross the center, just like so, and go up to positive infinity. And that's our tangent graph. Let's do one more. So let's do one more here. F of x equals, we'll do negative 2 tangent of pi over 3 plus 6. Okay, so our vertical shift here is obviously 6. Our amplitude here is going to be negative 2. And the period is pi divided by pi over 3. In other words, pi times 3 over pi cancels out the pi. We get a period of 3. So graphing this, again, gives us our vertical and our vertical asymptotes right here equally to both sides of the vertical axis. And we're ready to label our vertical axis. In the center is our vertical shift. We're going to go up our amplitude, which gives us up to 8, and down our amplitude, which gives us down to 4. We're going to hit these marks at exactly the halfway point. However, in this case, the amplitude is negative. So instead of coming down from negative infinity and going up, since it's a negative, it flips the entire thing vertically, and so we're going to actually come from positive infinity and go down to negative. So we're going to hit the halfway part. We're going to hit the actual halfway point right here. We're going to go through the middle, and we're going to go down our amplitude by the halfway point. What is this halfway point? Well, let's look at our horizontal axis. Our horizontal axis, well, our period here is 3. So half of that needs to be on one side, and half of it needs to be to the left. So half to the right, half to the left. Half of 3 is simply 3 halves. So this will be 3 halves, and this over here will be negative 3 halves. And now we're ready to graph. So we're going to come up from positive infinity. We're going to go down through our amplitude, down through our center, down through our other amplitude, and down to negative infinity. So this is the graph of negative 2 tangent of pi over 3, oh boy, pi over 3 x plus 6. There you go.